there is currently an attempt underway to suggest that there's some significant segment of the American population which has cheered and applauded and praised what Hamas did, celebrated it, justified it, including the grotesque attacks, deliberate attacks on civilians. And the reason that's being done is because, and we talked about how 9/11 is the key framework on Monday for understanding what's happened. I think clearly this attack on Israel is being treated in Israel like 9/11 was treated in the United States. But a lot of the rhetoric and the sentiments that have emerged from that attack are very similar as well. And of course, the key lesson from 9/11 that we reviewed on Monday is that even though I do think the rage that most Americans felt at the 9/11 attack was completely valid and the desire for vengeance was as well, by giving into those impulses and not balancing them with reason, and by believing what we were told that anything and everything the government wanted to do in the name of avenging that attack and fighting the terrorists was justified, we ended up endorsing a lot of things that most American polls show have come to regret. From the invasion of Iraq to the institution of torture regimes and rendition and kidnapping programs in Europe and due process-free prisons all over the world and the transformation of our government with the Patriot Act and warrantless eavesdropping. The lesson we learned is that you can be as horrified and disgusted and filled with rage, valid, righteous rage, as you want about an attack. It doesn't mean everything done in the name of stopping that attack or avenging it or preventing further attacks is justified. And it's our obligation as citizens to use our process of reason to balance our emotions in order to make the best decisions about what should and shouldn't be done. Now, the way that was suppressed, that process of reason, was that very early on we were told by our own government, by George Bush, reading a speech in front of the joint session of Congress on September 20th, 2001, 10 days after the 9/11 attack, a speech written by the neocon David Frum, who is now at The Atlantic. We were told that there are only two sides to this war on terror. You're either with the US government or you're with the terrorists. There's no third option. And in the days and the weeks and the months after the 9/11 attack, as a result of this righteous anger and rage that a lot of people felt, including myself, as I recounted on Monday, when I lived in Manhattan on the day of that attack and witnessed the same things everyone in Manhattan did, that we were told that if you stood up and questioned anything the Bush administration was doing, the war in Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, the enactment of the Patriot Act, the warrantless spying, you are pro-terrorist. You are on the side of Al-Qaeda. You are on the side of Osama bin Laden. It was a scummy and manipulative and shameful tactic that now is deployed in every war since then. It was deployed in the war in Iraq. People against the war in Iraq were told they were pro-Saddam Hussein. They were indifferent to the repression of Saddam Hussein. Same with Syria. They were told they were Assad lovers. People opposed to the regime change war in Libya were told they love Muammar Gaddafi. People opposed to the ongoing occupation of Afghanistan were told that they were apologists for the Taliban. They didn't care about the rights of Afghan women. And of course, the war in Ukraine, anyone who questions it at all, let alone opposes it, is instantly branded pro-Putin. This is the framework that people are now trying to create so that if you at all question anything that's done, either by the Israeli government or the American government, in the name of avenging these attacks, even questioning whether the U.S. should be involved, whether the U.S. should consider it its own war, that means you are pro-Hamas. There are only two choices. You're with the Israeli and American government, or you're on the side of Hamas. That's the same framework that's attempting to be constructed. And there's emerged this spate of articles, including by liberals who have an affinity for Israel in the Democratic Party, who are trying to claim that there's a significant portion of the American left that is celebrating Hamas and justifying and cheerleading the attacks on civilians, even though the only people who are doing this are marginalized people who are often denounced by their own allies and even forced to apologize. You can't name a prominent person who has done this. There's a couple of chapters of BLM. There's a few chapters of DSA, and even there, it's more individuals whose names aren't known who are celebrating Hamas. We showed you an individual who mocked the people who were kidnapped. They mocked them as hipsters and laughed about them, but there was revulsion even among those groups. But these groups are totally marginalized. In fact, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez came out and didn't just condemn the attacks from Hamas, but she harshly denounced DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, of which she's a member, for allowing any kind of celebration or defense of Hamas. This is a marginalized view, and yet there's an attempt to suggest that it's significant because there's an attempt to suggest that either you accept every aspect of what the U.S. and Israeli government does, or it means you're pro-Hamas. Here, for example, was an article by the ostensible leftist Naomi Klein, who's really just a Democratic Party hack. She's nothing more than that. And ever since Donald Trump's election, that's all she's been, like most American leftists. And she has an article in The Guardian. They changed the headline because of how much anger this provoked. But the original headline, you can see it there in The Guardian's tweet, quote, "Why are some on the left celebrating the killings of Israeli Jews?" And the most notable thing about this article is that there was not a single example that she identified of anyone who's supposedly celebrating Hamas's targeting of Israeli Jews. Because in order to offer names, you end up essentially acknowledging that this is a marginalized view that every decent person is disgusted by. This is not a serious view that people with influence wield. Even longtime critics of Israel, almost everyone that I know, expressed revulsion and disgust at what was done on Saturday to Israeli civilians and Israeli families, because it was the deliberate targeting of civilian life and the extinguishing of it, which is always unjustified and morally reprehensible. And that's the overwhelming view. And yet they are trying to invent a faction of people in the United States who are cheering Hamas and not admitting that it's trivial, again, to suggest, to link you, if you question anything, to being on the side of Hamas. That's what this is about. Here is an article in New York Magazine, and it's by a very similar person to Naomi Klein, Eric Levitz, who also criticizes Israel but has an affinity for it. And here you see his title. He's trying to do the same thing as Naomi Klein. Quote, "A left that refuses to condemn mass murder is doomed." Now, unlike Naomi Klein, he actually did include a few examples of people that he claims are guilty of refusing to condemn mass murder by Hamas. And the reason it's valuable that he did is because this is when you see how marginalized these people are. Here's what he wrote, quote, "It is not hyperbole to say that many left-wing supporters of Palestine celebrated Hamas's atrocities. It's absolutely hyperbole to say that. Here are his examples. The national leadership of Students for Justice in Palestine," which I have to say, as somebody who has covered the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for more than a decade, is a group I've never heard of. That's his first example. "The national leadership of Students for Justice in Palestine declared that this weekend's events are, quote, a historic win for the Palestinian resistance, touting Hamas's success in, quote, catching the enemy completely by surprise. The Connecticut chapter of the Democratic Socialists of America applauded the Palestinians' resistance, quote, unprecedented anti-colonial struggle, pledged its solidarity for that struggle, and vowed, quote, no peace on stolen land. And at a rally co-sponsored by socialist organizations in New York City, one speaker who nobody knows his name, this is the one we showed you, spoke approvingly of the mass murder of Israeli teenagers, saying, quote, there was some sort of rave or desert party where they were having a great time until the resistance came and electrified hang gliders and took at least several dozen hipsters. So those are his three examples. Some Connecticut chapter of DSA, a single individual at a DSA rally who a lot of people at that own rally were horrified by, who mocked the victims, the Israeli victims, and then some group that's pretty obscure. He then adds, quote, some left-wing intellectuals, meanwhile, chose to gussy up their ardor for war crimes in layers of impenetrable jargon. Speaking plainly would have required such thinkers to acknowledge that they were endorsing the mass murder of children, and thus to assume the extraordinary burden of justifying this stance, which is to say, the burden of explaining why we should believe that Palestinian liberation can be achieved through the killing of Jewish children and only through the killing of Jewish children. It's understandable then that instead of forthrightly making the case, many chose to convey the sentiment, quote, oppressed people have a right to commit mass murder, with as much opacity and pseudo-profundity as the hard-won vocabularies would allow. And then here was his example, having built this whole thing up about these people who are so terrible. These remarks from an editor of The Drift, a socialist magazine, are exemplary. Now again, I've never heard of The Drift. So the fact that you have to, I'm not saying nobody expressed these repulsive views. They did. We covered them on Monday Night Show. But we did it to demonstrate that it is a tiny marginalized view. And again, I'm somebody who has criticized Israel for a long time, but the minute I saw those videos, there was no ambivalence about what I felt about the targeting of innocent people in Israel. It's repulsive and enraging. But this is what anybody in a position of authority or influence or prominence is saying, even those who are simultaneously expressing support for the Palestinian cause. Here, for example, is Ilhan Omar, who is probably one of the top 2 or 3 Israel critics in the US Congress, by which I mean one of the 2 or 3 people, along with Rashida Tlaib and a couple members of the squad, willing to criticize Israel most harshly. And here's the statement she issued on October 7th, which was the first day of the conflict. Quote, I condemn the horrific acts we are seeing unfold today in Israel against children, women, the elderly, and the unarmed people who are being slaughtered and taken hostage by Hamas. Such senseless violence will only repeat the back and forth cycle we've seen, which we cannot allow to continue. We need to call for de-escalation and a ceasefire. I will keep advocating for peace and justice throughout the Middle East. Now, some people were angry that she called for de-escalation, but she did not celebrate at all the civilian massacres of Hamas. Quite the contrary, she quite emphatically and unambiguously denounced it, as did almost everybody of any significance. Here is AOC herself on the same day, quote, I condemn Hamas's attacks in the strongest possible terms. Does it get clearer than that? Not only did AOC say, I condemn Hamas's attacks in the strongest possible terms, but today, or rather yesterday, she came out and harshly denounced that DSA protest in New York for allowing some of the speakers to express some of those views that we covered. There you see the political headline, AOC knocks, quote, bigotry and callousness of Times Square rally for Palestinians. Quote, it should not be hard to shut down hatred and anti-Semitism where we see it. This is a core tenet of solidarity. Now, I say all that not to defend those people or their views, but simply to point out that we are not going to fall. I'm not going to fall, at least this time, or allowed to be perpetrated this lie that either you uncritically and mindlessly endorse and cheerlead for every last thing the Israeli and American governments do, or you stand accused of being pro-Hamas. That is a lie. It is a manipulative propaganda tactic, just like it is in all those other wars I reviewed where it's used. There's an attempt underway, however, to try and imply that by essentially saying there are only 2 camps, people who support everything Israel and the United States does and those who celebrate Hamas. And there's huge numbers of people in the middle, in a wide range in the middle, who are saying, I think what Hamas did is reprehensible, but I still don't want my own government, the United States government, to treat it as its war and get involved in that war. That's Israel's war to fight. They have all the military hardware. I'm even in favor of providing them with arms, some people are saying, but I still don't want the United States to be involved. And then there are other people who are saying that they're critical of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and the blockade of Gaza, but nonetheless find what Hamas is doing reprehensible as well. There's unless people are praising Hamas and what they did, which is a tiny number of people, nobody should be called pro-Hamas or on the side of Hamas for questioning what their own government is doing. That is an absolute, not only right, but a duty that you have when your government is involved in war. And that's especially true given how many American politicians are essentially calling for Israel to wipe out all of Gaza, or even arguing that this should be America's war. We should treat it as America's war. I quoted earlier the statement of Nikki Haley, who the day after that attack happened, she went on Fox News and she said to Prime Minister Netanyahu, finish them, finish them. She suggested that Iran was also involved, and she explicitly said this is not only an attack on Israel, but an attack on the United States. It is not an attack on the United States. That is just the reality. It was an attack on Israel. Those are two separate countries. Here is Marco Rubio, who, like Lindsey Graham and like Nikki Haley, and I'm sorry, this is just a fact, cheerlead and support and advocate for every single American war fought over the last 25 years and ones that haven't been fought but that are proposed. If there's a war, two things you know for certain about Marco Rubio. One is he's nowhere near the fighting, nor is his family. And number two, he's an advocate, ardent advocate of that war and of U.S. participation in it. Here's what he said on October 10th about this new war.
And the message needs to be, if the U.S. is attacked or this thing is escalated that implicates whether it's U.S. servicemen in the region, servicewomen in the region, or facilities in the region, whether it's Iran directly or through their proxies, we're going to hold Iran responsible. We're going to consider it an attack by the Iranian state, and we will respond in kind. And that.
So why would you be issuing war threats to Iran? Again, that's my question. How many? I thought the Republican Party voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and then made him his nominee in 2020, went to vote for him for president because he convinced Republicans, and a lot of Republicans already thought this, which is why they were attracted to the message, that we have to stop being involved in so many wars, that the only wars we should be fighting are wars when our own national security or homeland are directly threatened. And if you listen to Marco Rubio, who is a huge supporter of the U.S. role and participation in the war in Ukraine, that's one war we should be fighting, the proxy war against Russia. Another war we should be fighting is the war with Israel, that this is an attack on the United States as well. He obviously has said many times that we should go to war with China in the event they get more aggressive or attack Taiwan, which is a foreign country. And here he is threatening war with Iran. How many wars are we going to fight? Against how many big, powerful countries are we going to conduct wars? Apparently, according to Nikki Haley and Marco Rubio, the answer is a lot. A lot. Pretty much against every major country, apparently, that does anything other than do the United States' bidding. Here is Lindsey Graham, who unsurprisingly came forward with a statement that when it comes to unhinged and deranged warmongering, outdid even Nikki Haley and Marco Rubio, which is not easy to do. Listen to what he said.
We're in a religious war here. I am with Israel. Do whatever the hell you have to do to defend yourself. Level the place.
Okay. So we're going to get in just a minute to how many Israelis in the media are disgusted by what Lindsey Graham said. It's really easy to be in a safe distance, sitting in the United States, and calling for Israel to just obliterate Gaza, just carpet bomb it and turn it into a parking lot, even though it has 2.2 million people concentrated in an extremely dense area, half of whom are children. I don't understand, I genuinely don't understand how you can simultaneously express revulsion for what Hamas did in targeting innocent people and children and not be repulsed by this call to wipe out Gaza. I mean, that would be genocide. The Gazans cannot leave Gaza. They're blockaded for most of their border by Israel and part of their border by Egypt. And the reason Egypt blockades them is because Egypt is a huge recipient of U.S. aid. When Egypt one time had an election and voted for Mohamed Morsi, who was more pro-Palestinian than any other leader, he was a member of the Muslim Brotherhood, that's who Egyptians chose. The Egyptian military overthrew him and installed General Sisi, and John Kerry applauded that because we wanted the Egyptians to do the bidding, including making sure that those Gazans are trapped inside Gaza. So Egypt is involved for that reason, but nonetheless, the Gazans cannot leave. There was even talk about allowing them to leave through Egypt, but then the crossing got bombed, and the Egyptians don't seem eager to allow hundreds of thousands or millions of Gazans to enter their country. So if you're talking about leveling Gaza or wiping out Gaza like Lindsey Graham did, you're talking about knowingly and purposefully killing hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million children, Palestinian children who live in Gaza, on top of the number of innocent adults, civilians, who have never participated in violence. Now, I will not accept any suggestion that if you think that the lives of Palestinian children have value and that it is psychotic to call for their mass extermination, that makes you pro-Hamas. In fact, I see a lot more similarities between people like Lindsey Graham and Hamas than I do between people who think that all human life has value for innocent civilians, including children. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.